Have you ever had one of those moments where you suddenly stop and realize you've been on your phone for like 20 minutes, and you don't even remember what you were looking for? You just kept scrolling. One video, then another, and somewhere in there you kind of disappeared. Now, here's the strange part. In that moment, were you actually choosing what you were doing? Or was something else quietly running the show? Because if you look closely, that same thing might be shaping a lot more of your reality than you think. Terence McKenna was not your typical philosopher, and he definitely didn't come from the kind of world you'd expect. He was active mostly in the 1970s through the early 2000s, a time when conversations around consciousness, psychedelics, and the nature of reality were starting to re-emerge in Western culture, but were still considered fringe, even controversial. McKenna was an ethnobotanist by training, which basically means he studied the relationship between humans and plants. But what made him stand out was how far he was willing to go with that question. He spent years traveling through the Amazon, studying indigenous traditions, and exploring altered states of consciousness, not just as an idea, but as a direct experience. And through that, he became known for something very specific. He was one of the most influential voices arguing that what we call reality is not as stable or as objective as we assume, that it can shift depending on how we perceive it, how we interpret it, and even what state of mind we're in. Now that might sound abstract at first, but McKenna didn't present it that way. He spoke about it in a very grounded, almost unsettlingly practical way, suggesting that most of what we experience day to day is not reality itself, but a kind of filtered version of it, shaped by language, culture, and repetition. And this is where it connects directly to what we're exploring today. Because if that's true, if reality is something that's being constructed moment by moment through perception, then the question becomes a lot more personal. It's no longer just, what is reality? It's what kind of reality have I been living inside of, without even noticing it? And more importantly, what might be possible if I started seeing it differently? Think about this in a really simple way. Right now, as you're listening to this, your brain is taking in a ton of information. Sounds, sensations, thoughts, memories. But you're not experiencing all of it. You're only experiencing what your mind selects, organizes, and interprets. In other words, you're not seeing reality directly. You're seeing a version of it, a filtered version. Now, most of the time, that's fine. We need that filter to function. But here's where it gets interesting. That filter isn't just biological. It's cultural, it's psychological, and it's heavily shaped by the environment you live in. And here's where it gets a little uncomfortable. You don't see reality as it is. You see what you've been trained to notice. And most of that training didn't come from you. Take your daily life. You wake up, check your phone. Maybe you open Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. Within seconds, you're hit with a stream of information that's been specifically designed to hold your attention. Fast cuts, bright colors, emotional hooks. And over time, your brain starts to adapt to that pace. So now, when things are slow, when nothing is happening, when you're just sitting in silence, it feels uncomfortable, almost like something is missing. But nothing is missing. You've just been trained to expect constant stimulation. And here's where it starts affecting your life in ways you don't immediately notice. Now, let's be honest for a second. This isn't just distraction. It's training. Your attention is being trained moment by moment to expect speed, stimulation, and constant input. Because the more your attention gets pulled outward, the less familiar you become with what's happening inward. And after a while, silence starts to feel unnatural. Not because it is, but because you've been away from it for too long. And that changes how you experience reality. Because now, anything that doesn't immediately grab your attention starts to feel less real, less important, less engaging. And that includes your own thoughts, your own emotions, and your sense of direction in life. The very things that are supposed to guide you. This is where a lot of people start to feel lost. Not because they don't have options, but because they've lost connection with what actually matters to them. Everything becomes reactive. You respond to what's in front of you, what's trending, what's urgent, but you're not really choosing, you're just moving along with the current. And after a while, it stops feeling like a current. It just feels like your life. Most people don't actually choose their lives, they slowly inherit them. And then one day, they wake up inside a life they never consciously decided to live. I remember a friend telling me something that stuck with me. He had a good job, stable income, everything looked right from the outside. And one day he just sat in his car after work, engine off, not going anywhere, and he realized he didn't feel anything about his life. Not stress, not excitement, just nothing. And the thought that came up was simple, but it hit hard. Is this really what I've been building toward? And this is the part people don't usually say out loud. A lot of people right now are quietly questioning their lives, but not in a dramatic way, more like a low-level signal in the background. Something like, is this actually it? And it shows up in small moments, like when you're sitting in traffic after work, or when you close your laptop at the end of the day and realize you've been busy for 10 hours, but you don't feel any clearer about your life than you did in the morning. And one of the biggest places this shows up is in work. You see people switching careers more than ever, people leaving stable jobs, people trying to build something on their own, and on the surface it looks like ambition. But underneath it there's often something else, something harder to name, a feeling that the structure they're inside doesn't match who they are anymore. And what's interesting is that a lot of these people can't fully explain why they feel that way. They'll say things like, I just needed a change, or I wasn't passionate about it. But if you sit with it a little longer, what's really happening is that their internal experience doesn't line up with the external path they're on. And this is exactly the kind of thing McKenna was pointing toward. He believed that culture builds a kind of shared reality, a set of expectations about what a life is supposed to look like, what success means, what a normal path is. And once you internalize that, it starts to feel like truth instead of just one version of reality. So you follow it, you move forward, you do the things you're supposed to do, but every now and then something in you resists. Not loudly, not in a way that forces you to stop, but quietly, like a subtle tension you can't quite ignore. You can be moving forward in life and still feel like you're moving away from yourself. I've also heard this in a completely different context. Someone told me they'd been on dozens of dates through apps, met a lot of people, had good conversations, nothing obviously wrong. But after a while it all started to feel the same. Same questions, same patterns, same version of themselves showing up each time. And at some point they said, I don't even know if anyone is actually meeting me, or just the version of me that fits this environment. And when you step back and look at dating as a whole, something starts to feel off. People have more options than ever. More apps, more connections, more ways to meet people. And yet at the same time, a lot of people feel more disconnected than they used to. Conversations feel repetitive. Interactions feel surface level. And there's this growing sense that even though you're constantly in contact with people, you're not really being seen. And part of that is because the same thing is happening there too. You're not just meeting people, you're interacting through filters, expectations, curated identities, and over time it becomes harder to tell what's real and what's just presentation. So again, the experience of reality starts to shift. It becomes flatter, faster, less grounded. And if you stay in that long enough, you begin to feel like something is missing, but you can't quite say what. Now let's take it one step further. Think about the current moment, especially with everything happening around AI, automation, and the speed of change. For the first time, a lot of people are starting to feel uncertain about their place in the future. And that leads to a deeper question. If who you are is tied to what you do, what happens when what you do becomes replaceable? If the skills you built your life around can be replaced, if the systems you trusted are changing faster than you can adapt, then naturally the question comes up. Where do I fit in all of this? And again, that question isn't always loud. It shows up as anxiety, as restlessness, as a feeling that you should be doing something but you don't know what that something is. And this is where things start to connect. Because what McKenna was really suggesting is that reality is not just something happening to you. It's something you are constantly interpreting and reinforcing. And when the structures around you start to shift, the way you experience reality shifts with them. So if your environment is fast, fragmented, uncertain, then your internal experience often starts to mirror that. You feel scattered, you feel uncertain, you feel like you're always trying to catch up to something that keeps moving. And the more you try to stabilize it externally, the more unstable it can feel internally. So the real question becomes, if so much of what you experience is shaped by interpretation, by conditioning, by the environment you've adapted to, then how much of what you're living right now is actually aligned with you, and how much of it is something you've learned to accept without ever really examining it? So here's the real question, not what reality is, but what kind of reality you've been unconsciously agreeing to live inside. At this point, it might be tempting to try to figure it out, to come up with an answer to define what's real and what isn't. But that's usually where we go back into the same pattern, trying to solve something conceptually instead of noticing it directly. So instead of doing that, try something simpler. Just pay attention to your own experience, not in a forced way. Not like you're trying to analyze it, but more like you're observing something that's already happening. Right now, as you're listening to this, just notice something simple. Notice that you're aware of these words. Not the meaning of them, not the thoughts about them, just the fact that they're being heard. And then notice that the awareness itself is already there, even before you try to understand anything. For example, the next time you feel that urge to check your phone, don't stop it immediately. Just notice it. Notice how automatic it is, how it shows up before you've really made a conscious decision. And see what happens if you pause for a second before acting on it. Or when you're in the middle of your workday and you feel that slight resistance, that moment where your attention drifts and you feel a bit disconnected from what you're doing. Instead of pushing through it right away, just acknowledge it, even for a few seconds. Not to fix it, just to see it clearly. The same thing applies in conversations. When you're talking to someone and you notice yourself thinking about what to say next instead of actually listening, that's another moment, a very subtle one, but it's there. And if you catch it, even briefly, something shifts. You become a little more present, a little less automatic. And these moments are important, not because they solve anything immediately, but because they start to show you how much of your experience is happening on autopilot. And once you begin to see that, even in small ways, your relationship with reality starts to change. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually. You start to feel the difference between reacting and actually choosing, between following a pattern and stepping outside of it, even if just for a moment. And over time, those moments add up. You begin to trust your own perception a little more, not the version that's constantly shaped by external input, but the quieter one underneath it. The one that doesn't need to be reinforced all the time. And this is where something interesting happens. The same world is still there, the same job, the same people, the same environment, but it doesn't feel exactly the same anymore. There's a bit more space in your experience, a bit less pressure to immediately define everything, and that space allows something else to emerge. Something that feels more aligned, more natural, even if you can't fully explain it. And maybe that's the point. Not to arrive at a final understanding, but to start seeing how your experience is being shaped in real time, and to realize that you're not as locked into it as it once seemed. So if you take a step back and look at all of this, the question isn't really whether reality is real or not, or whether perception is accurate or distorted. It's something more personal than that. It's whether the way you're currently experiencing your life actually feels true to you. Not in a logical sense, not in a way that you can easily explain to someone else, but in a direct, internal way. Because if reality is something you're participating in, if it's shaped by attention, interpretation, and the patterns you've been conditioned into, then even small shifts in awareness can start to change how it feels. Not by forcing anything, not by trying to become someone else, but by noticing what's already happening more clearly. And maybe that's where things begin to open up. Not in some dramatic transformation, but in a subtle shift in how you relate to your own experience. So the next time you find yourself moving through your day automatically, reacting, scrolling, rushing, just pause for a moment and ask yourself something simple. What am I actually experiencing right now, before I label it, before I explain it, before I move past it? And if you stay with that question, even briefly, you might start to notice something that was always there but easy to miss. Not a new reality, just a different way of seeing the one you're already in. This has been What We Are, a space for slowing down just enough to actually notice what's going on. Not just out there, but in here, in the way we think, react, and experience our lives. If this exploration of Terence McKenna and the nature of reality made you pause, even for a moment, share it with someone who's been questioning things lately. Someone who feels like something is off but can't quite explain why. And if you find yourself coming back to these conversations, take a second to subscribe. Not just to follow the channel, but to stay connected to this kind of space, where we're not rushing to answers, but learning how to see more clearly. Thank you for being here and for giving your attention to something deeper than the noise. And until next time, stay aware of how you're seeing, because that might be shaping more of your reality than you think. And once you start seeing that, it's very hard to go back to noticing it.